I'm Nancy Johnson. I'm a professor in the English department at Western Washington University, where I teach children's literature and young adult literature, among other classes. I've had the good fortune at Western to work with our annual Children's Literature Conference. This is our 14th year. And I've also had the good fortune to serve on the Newbery Committee as well as the Caldecott Committee. And this year I am on the Batchelder Committee, less known, but it's a committee for translated books for children and teens.
Hello, I'm Sylvia Tagg, and I am a librarian at the Western Washington University Library. And I am the curator of our children's literature collections here, which include fiction, nonfiction, include poetry. I work closely with our special collections. We have fabulous materials in our holdings that go actually back to the origins of Western as a teaching college in a normal school. Putting books into the hands of kids and teens is something that I feel makes my day worthwhile. I did have the honor of being on the Newbery for 2015, and currently I'm on the Bechtel Committee, which examines and supports special collections. One of our books that I wanted to talk about and was so excited to is actually checked out, which is a good thing. That's like a librarian's dream, right? It's called The Inquisitor's Tale, and it's something that I would highly recommend people checking out. Little book, curl up with this little book. It's two kids who find that they've been in a car has in the winter has gone off the road, and their mom has gone off to get help, and they find that they need to leave and get some help themselves because it keeps getting colder and colder. But these are fairy tales and folk tales, and he has done a creative sculpture next to a brief summary of what he considers maybe to be the essence of each of these fairy tales, and kind of edgy, you know, right? So this lovely book, Cry Hard But Never Break, death arrives at the doorstep of a family with 4 children, and their grandmother is dying upstairs. And the children decide that if they make death a cup of tea, they can delay him long enough and keep their grandmother alive. And while they're sipping tea with death, he tells them a story. And he tells them a story that actually grief and sorrow need to live side by side with joy and delight. And it works metaphorically, it works as a comfort for the children. And let's see, the last one, this one you might already know about, They All Saw a Cat. It's a fabulous, lovely picture book, and it's a picture book about a cat journeying through the world and all the different creatures, animals, people that see the cat, and the cat becomes illustrated from their perspective. So here's the flea in the midst of ever wonder how a flea sees a cat?
I'll start with a book I read very early in the year of PAX by Sarah Pennypacker. Mostly known, but a lot of people know her for her Clementine books, her early reader books. This is a tour de force. And it has one of the most heartbreaking opening chapters. I didn't know if I could go on reading it, and I'm so glad I did. This is the third and the last of John Clausen's hat books. It just came out. We found a hat, and you know, it might end up being my favorite. The color palette is absolutely perfect. You have 2 turtles this time who find one hat, and they both covet this hat. So I'll move from that to, I'll stay with illustration, because a lot of my books this year, in fact all 4 of my favorites are illustrated books. Snow White by Matt Phelan, who will be at Western's Children's Literature Conference this February. Matt Phelan has taken what we would call a pretty well-known story, Snow White, and decided to set it during 1920s, during the Jazz Age in New York City. And again, talk about, you know, muted use of color. He retells Snow White with very little red and very little text. And the last book I'd like to talk about is a collection of poetry, and this one came to me, I love how things happen. I was reading some site about best books or best new books, and Jazz Day, the making of a famous photograph, was featured. Told the story of that day through different jazz musicians.
So here are a couple of books that adults, YA books that adults should be reading. Steve Schenken and Philip Hoos are both master nonfiction authors. So the Boys Who Challenged Hitler, the Churchill Gang, this is actually, well, they're based on an actual club that existed in Denmark. Some teens who got together to fight the occupation and resistance, and who were on bicycles blowing up munitions. It's extraordinary, and based on interviews and archives that the author read and used as primary sources for the writing of the book.
Some of his roots, it is a utopia. He said it is not a dystopia, this is a utopia. It's called Scythe. And anyone who's read The Giver will go, oh, this reminds me somewhat of The Giver, that perfect world that we've created where people aren't hungry and where there's no murder. And it's a story of good guys and bad guys. It's a story of, is a utopia ever really a utopia? And it's a story that a lot of teens will love because it is the first in a series, but it's spectacularly written. And I would love to read this as a parent or a teacher with some teens and talk about the news, for example, and talk about the decisions and and technology.
This book, The Journey, is a book that represents a journey of a family that is from a Middle Eastern country. It's not specifically declared, but the city is under siege, and the father is lost, and the mother and the children choose to make the journey north. And so this is a story that we hear about on the news every day that I imagine some kids are cluing into, they're picking up on, but again, kids are very aware, they hear adults talking, and here's a book that could be shared with kids or just on a bookshelf that they would come across. And you can see that they start out with all their worldly possessions, and as the book goes through, the possessions diminish, and they have to trust people. They have to trust people that are kind of scary and intimidating. So it has this darkness as well as the light of each other. It's about traveling, it's about journey, it's about fear, it's about expectation, it's about finding a new home. And by the end, they've arrived north, but they still have many questions, and they're in a new place. So it's a pretty remarkable book.